What happens when a dictator who has ruled for over 30 years suddenly runs out of time? 7 days. That is all Volodymyr Zelensky gave Alexander Lukashenko. And what happened next tells you everything about who really holds power in this war. Before we go further, hit that like button right now, because this story only gets more intense from here. Subscribe if you want to understand what is really happening behind the headlines, and send this to one person who still thinks Belarus is just a bystander in this war, because they are about to find out how wrong that is. Let's start with the man who suddenly found himself trapped. Alexander Lukashenko has run Belarus since 1994, long before smartphones, long before most wars we talk about today even began. He has survived sanctions, mass protests, and international isolation by doing one thing extremely well: staying loyal to Moscow while pretending to the rest of the world that he is neutral. For years, that balancing act worked. He got weapons, political cover, and cheap energy from Russia. In return, he gave Vladimir Putin a border, a launch pad, and a loyal voice on the world stage whenever Moscow needed one. But balancing acts only work as long as nobody forces you to pick a side. And in June 2026, someone finally did. On June 19th, at a press conference in Kyiv, President Zelensky stood beside the visiting president of Honduras and made an announcement that would shake the region. He said Belarus was hosting equipment on communication towers, positioned in the Gomel and Brest regions along the Ukrainian border. This wasn't ordinary infrastructure. According to Zelensky, these towers were being used to help guide Russian drone and artillery strikes into Ukraine, hitting energy grids, railways, and civilian areas far from the actual front line, in regions like Zhytomyr, Rivne, and Volyn. Think about that for a second. Belarus insists it wants no part of this war. Yet, according to Ukraine's own president, equipment sitting quietly on Belarusian soil was helping Russian drones fly further, strike harder, and hit targets Ukraine wasn't fully prepared to defend. It is one thing to claim neutrality. It is another thing entirely to have your own territory used as a weapon against your neighbor while you say nothing about it. So Zelensky did something no Ukrainian leader had done before. He didn't file a diplomatic complaint. He didn't wait quietly for allies to weigh in. He looked straight into the cameras and gave Lukashenko a deadline. He said a week would be enough time to shut the equipment down, and warned that if it wasn't done, Ukraine would do it themselves. He explained the urgency in blunt, human terms too. Every single day the towers stayed active, Ukrainian civilians were dying, and children were being wounded because of it. 7 days, not 7 weeks. Not as soon as possible. 7 days with a clear and public warning attached, broadcast in front of international cameras where there was no room left for quiet denial. This is the moment the title of this video refers to. Ukraine wasn't just asking Belarus to be more careful. It was threatening to strike inside Belarusian territory if the equipment wasn't removed. For a country that has spent decades avoiding direct conflict with its neighbors, this was as close to a declared first strike warning as it gets. Now picture the pressure Lukashenko suddenly felt. On one side, Ukraine now openly says it can strike Belarus and is prepared to do it. On the other side, Moscow expects total loyalty, and any sign of bending to Kyiv's demands could be read by the Kremlin as betrayal. Lukashenko had spent his entire career avoiding exactly this kind of impossible choice. Now it was sitting on his desk with a countdown attached, live on television, with no easy way to hide. And this wasn't an empty threat from Kyiv. Ukraine's military has changed dramatically over the past few years. Its long-range drone program can now reach deep into Russian territory, something almost nobody believed possible when this war began. In June 2025, Ukrainian intelligence pulled off an operation that shocked military analysts worldwide. Drones, smuggled deep inside Russia, launched a coordinated strike hitting 5 separate air bases across 5 different time zones in a single operation, destroying dozens of aircraft, including irreplaceable strategic bombers and radar planes. If Ukraine could reach that deep into Russia itself, striking Belarus, a country a fraction of the size with far weaker and more outdated air defenses, would not be difficult at all. And Ukraine wasn't shy about reminding Belarus of exactly that. While Zelensky kept his public tone measured, the commander of Ukraine's drone forces was far more direct. He publicly stated that hundreds of potential targets inside Belarus had already been identified and marked, comparing Lukashenko to a dog that barks but does not bite, and warning him in blunt terms to stay out of Ukraine's way. That kind of statement is not just intimidation. It is a signal that the planning had already happened long before the ultimatum was ever announced. The maps were ready, the coordinates were logged. The only decision left was whether to press forward. If you're finding this story as unbelievable as I did when I first read it, do me a favor and tap that subscribe button now. This channel breaks down exactly what's happening in this war, without the noise and without the spin, and trust me, the next part of this story gets even more tense. So what did Lukashenko actually do with his 7 days? For almost the entire week, he said nothing publicly about the ultimatum at all. He gave a long interview to a major international outlet, covering nearly every global issue you could imagine, offering his opinions on everything from regional security to global diplomacy, but conveniently avoided the one topic everyone was actually waiting to hear about. Silence, in diplomacy, is rarely neutral. It usually means someone is scrambling behind the scenes to figure out their next move without looking like they are scrambling at all. And behind that silence, something was clearly happening. According to reporting from independent Belarusian outlets monitoring drone traffic along the border, the last Russian drone crossing through Belarusian airspace was tracked just before the deadline expired. Then, quietly, the crossing stopped. On June 22nd, just days into the ultimatum, the relay equipment reportedly went dark. 2 days later, Zelensky confirmed it publicly. He stated that, according to the information his government had received, the equipment had stopped operating inside Belarusian territory as of June 22nd. Let that sink in. A leader who has ruled unchallenged for over 3 decades, a man closely allied with one of the most powerful militaries on earth, appeared to fold to a public ultimatum from Ukraine, a country he has never officially recognized as being at war with him. But here's where the story gets more complicated and more human. Lukashenko couldn't simply admit he backed down. His entire political identity, his entire relationship with Moscow, depends on him never looking weak in front of his own people or the Kremlin. So instead of confirming any kind of surrender, he flipped the narrative entirely. According to Belarus's own state news agency, Lukashenko claimed he had personally warned Ukrainian negotiators that if Zelensky believed he could talk to Belarus this way and pressure the country into war, the entire nature of the conflict would shift dramatically and become something far more serious. He insisted Belarus stood for peace, but made it clear that no matter what happened, his country would remain standing beside Russia. In other words, he shut the equipment down, but publicly pretended he was doing Ukraine a diplomatic favor rather than following an order under threat. It's a move classic to Lukashenko's style. He has survived over 30 years in power partly because of this exact skill, appearing to lose without ever admitting he lost. He even hinted at retaliation elsewhere. At one point, reports suggested he floated the idea of targeting something far more dangerous if provoked further, the Chernobyl nuclear plant, a location whose name alone still carries decades of fear across the region. Whether that was a genuine threat or simply theater meant to save face in front of Moscow, it revealed just how cornered he felt in that moment. Interestingly, this wasn't even the first crisis of its kind between the two leaders. Tensions between Kyiv and Minsk had been quietly building since spring, after Zelensky suggested Ukraine could theoretically capture Lukashenko himself, under the pretext of preventing a Belarusian invasion, a comment that visibly rattled the Belarusian leader. The two countries had already gone through a similar standoff back in the summer of 2024, when accusations and warnings flew back and forth over troop movements near the shared border. That earlier crisis eventually cooled down without incident. This one didn't cool down quietly. This one ended with Lukashenko publicly, if reluctantly, complying. This moment matters far beyond one ultimatum about drone equipment. It represents something much bigger, a complete reversal in how the balance of power in this region actually works. Let's rewind to 2022 for a moment, because the contrast is stunning. Back then, when Russia launched its full invasion of Ukraine, Lukashenko allowed Russian troops to stage their attack directly from Belarusian soil. Missiles launched from inside Belarus struck targets deep inside Ukraine in those earliest days of the war. At the time, that decision made sense from his perspective. Putin looked unstoppable. Kyiv was widely expected to fall within days. Betting against Russia looked like political suicide, and betting with Russia looked like the safest possible choice. Fast forward 4 years, and that calculation has completely flipped. Ukraine now has long-range strike capability that can reach deep into Russian territory itself. Russian air defenses, once considered a wall protecting the entire region, are being pulled back and concentrated. According to Ukrainian intelligence claims, Russia has been redeploying massive numbers of air defense systems specifically to protect Moscow, the Kerch Bridge, and Putin's own residents, stripping coverage from other regions because Russia can no longer defend everywhere at once. Some estimates suggest close to 90 air defense systems alone were pulled back just to guard one presidential residence. If this is true, it means something remarkable. Russia may no longer be capable of protecting its own closest ally, and Lukashenko knows it. If you're starting to see how deep this rabbit hole goes, that's exactly why we're covering it. Drop a comment right now with just one word, ultimatum, so I know you're following along, and let's keep going. Because the next part explains exactly why Lukashenko was actually terrified, not just annoyed. Why would Lukashenko take Ukraine's threat so seriously? Because Belarus simply does not have the resources to absorb a real military campaign. Consider this. Belarus has essentially only 2 major oil refineries that generate significant revenue for the country, supplying fuel that also benefits the Russian war effort. Compare that to Russia, which has nearly 40 large refineries. If Ukraine were to apply even a fraction of that same pressure to Belarus's 2 critical refineries, the economic damage would be catastrophic. There would be no redundancy, no backup system, and no way to absorb the hit without crippling the country's economy almost overnight. And it's not only about infrastructure. Analysts note Lukashenko's biggest fear likely isn't economic collapse, it's personal safety. His greatest concern centers on his own physical vulnerability, once a neighbor states it has mapped out potential targets across your territory. Lukashenko himself has described Belarus as militarily exposed, comparing his country to an open hand laid out defenseless. This is the psychological weight behind that 7-day countdown. It was a reminder that Ukraine now has the capability to strike. For a leader who has spent his entire career avoiding direct confrontation, that is as close to an existential threat as it gets. And here's the twist. This wasn't even the first time these relay systems had come under fire. Back in February, Zelensky claimed Ukrainian forces successfully knocked out some of this exact same equipment. These drone repeaters had been boosting the accuracy and real-time targeting ability of Russian drones, striking Ukrainian troops and civilians. So this conflict over the relay towers wasn't a sudden incident. It was the latest chapter in a slow, quiet escalation. What changed in June was Zelensky's willingness to name it publicly, attach a deadline, and threaten direct consequences. For nearly 4 years, Ukraine treated Belarus with extreme caution. That caution is gone now. Kyiv has moved from a defensive posture toward Belarus into something far more direct. Open confrontation backed by explicit ultimatums. We're getting close to the most important part of this story, the part that determines what happens next in this entire region. So if you've made it this far, hit subscribe. This channel is going to keep tracking exactly how this plays out. Whether this shutdown proves permanent remains unclear, but it marks a sign of a much larger shift underway. Ukraine is no longer treating Belarus as simply a staging ground controlled by Russia. It is willing to apply direct pressure. Some analysts argue that Russia now faces its own uncomfortable dilemma regarding its closest allies. In this new era of drone-driven warfare, a real military buildup wouldn't necessarily look like the massive troop convoys of 2022. It could be far quieter, designed to stay invisible until the very last moment, keeping regional observers on edge. This was a test of whether Lukashenko still fully belongs to Russia or whether fear of Ukraine might start pulling him away. For 30 years, Lukashenko built his strategy on staying useful to Moscow for protection. For the first time, that idea is being tested. He shut the equipment down and denied he was afraid, but actions speak louder than press conferences. What his actions revealed is that after 4 years of war, the balance of fear in this region has quietly, permanently shifted. Hit like, subscribe, and share this, because 7 days may be over, but this story is far from finished.